The map has been asked to carry a burden Ezekiel never placed on it. Borders are colored, flags are pinned across continents, and Gog is made to stand for whichever power frightens the age most. Yet Ezekiel begins with a name addressed like a man, a land connected to him, and a command from God that leaves every modern headline outside the first sentence. Gog is set against the mountains of Israel after a people scattered and broken have been gathered again. That order matters. The prophecy will distinguish Gog from Magog. Follow the ancient world behind the names, and then watch Revelation carry them to the ends of the earth. The question behind every map waits farther ahead. Why does this enemy rise after restoration has begun? Ezekiel does not invite readers to build a chart from anxiety. He places a ruler before a restored people and lets the threat grow until it fills the horizon. The borders will return at the end, but stripped of their flags. Before they do, Gog's name will travel from a proposed conquest to a burial valley, and then to the last rebellion gathered against God. Ezekiel receives the word in chapter 38 with a direct command: set his face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. The phrase gives the two names different work. Gog is the leader being addressed. Magog is the land associated with him. The prophecy starts with a person at the head of an assault, not with two interchangeable countries. That distinction has often been lost because the names sound ready for a modern map. One claim fastens the Hebrew word Rosh to Russia. In the usual rendering, Rosh means chief or head, which is why older English Bibles speak of a chief prince. A minority grammatical reading treats it as a proper name. Neither reading turns a similarity of sound into proof about a present-day state. Meshech and Tubal stand beside Gog, and they are not empty syllables invented for a distant century. Their names already belong to Israel's remembered world. Ezekiel's hearers could recognize them as peoples beyond their immediate borders, names with weight in trade, warfare, and imperial geography. The force of the prophecy lies first in that world, where an enemy can be named without being reduced to a flag. Gog's title also keeps the attention on agency. He gathers allies, plans to seize goods, and leads an invasion. He is never presented as an accidental storm that blows across the land. The leader acts, the land is named, the coalition follows. That order will become crucial once the prophecy reveals that Gog's will is real, yet his road is not finally his to command. The wording matters because Ezekiel is not casual with titles. Elsewhere in his book, princes, shepherds, merchants, and kings are named according to the role they play in a moral drama. A ruler may possess armies and territory, but he remains answerable for what he intends to do with them. Gog enters in that same register. He is a figure who speaks through a campaign, not a label pasted over a future atlas. The text gives him a land, associations, and a rank. It does not pause to identify a capital, a dynasty, or a date by which later readers can settle every argument. That restraint is part of the prophecy's force. Ancient hearers did not live with modern nation-states, fixed passports, or borders printed in school books. They knew cities, peoples, kingdoms, trade routes, imperial reach, and regions whose names could move as empires rose and fell. To make Ezekiel answer a 21st century identification question before listening to his own description is to reverse the order of reading. First comes Gog, the hostile leader. Then comes Magog, the land named with him. Then comes the coalition. Only after that does the prophecy disclose why this march has been permitted at all. The grammatical discussion over Rosh should therefore be kept in proportion. Some interpreters have read it as a geographic proper name, while many translations understand it as the ordinary Hebrew term for chief. The difference may affect how a title is rendered, but it does not supply the chain of evidence needed to identify Russia or any other current state as the unavoidable answer. Similar sound is not historical continuity. Languages change, borders disappear, and political names are repeatedly reused. Ezekiel's argument does not rest on a verbal resemblance. It rests on the God who speaks to an invader before that invader has moved. This first distinction also prevents another error. Gog and Magog are not rivals in the sentence, nor are they a pair of equal rulers. In Ezekiel, Gog is of the land of Magog. When Revelation later places the two names side by side, readers must notice both continuity and development instead of reading John backward into Ezekiel's opening line. The film will return to that change. For now, the first sentence has already narrowed the responsible question, not which modern flag can be made to fit these syllables, but why is this particular leader summoned into the story after Israel has been promised life? The map becomes less useful when it is asked to answer a question the book has not yet reached. Ezekiel has already shown Israel in ruin before he introduces Gog. A watchman has spoken to exiles. Jerusalem has fallen. The people have watched their city burn and their temple vanish behind an enemy army. Gog appears only after that wound has begun to heal. Ezekiel himself was a priest among the exiles in Babylon. His early visions came beside the Chebar Canal, far from Jerusalem, where displacement was not an idea, but the shape of daily life. The city's destruction confirmed the warnings he had carried. For those who had survived, the ruin of Zion could seem to announce that their God had been defeated by the gods of Babylon. Then the book changes its direction. In chapter 34, God confronts Israel's failed shepherds and promises to seek his scattered sheep. In chapter 36, the defiled land is promised cleansing, a new heart, and a new spirit. The restoration is not a reward earned by a nation that repaired itself. It begins with God acting for the honor of his holy name among the nations. The vision of dry bones presses that promise into an image no exile could forget. A valley filled with bones receives breath. Sinew, flesh, and life return where no human hand could produce them. The vision speaks of the whole house of Israel, a people saying that their hope is cut off. God answers by promising life, return, and his spirit within them. Chapter 37 then joins the divided sticks of Judah and Joseph. The people who had known political fracture and national collapse are shown as one under one king. The sequence is deliberate: scattered sheep, renewed heart, living bones, reunited people. Gog enters after these promises, before the great vision of God's dwelling that fills the final chapters of Ezekiel. The order gives the enemy a different role from the one assigned by headline speculation. Gog does not arrive to start the story of Israel's restoration. He arrives as the last threat raised against a people already being restored by God. Death has given way to life. Division has given way to gathering. The danger that follows will test whether that restored life rests on human defenses or on the God who gave it. The placement of these visions is easy to overlook when Gog is isolated from the book around him. Ezekiel did not begin by offering a future battle scene. He began with the glory of God departing from a defiled Jerusalem and with messages explaining why judgment had come. The exile was not merely a national catastrophe, it was the exposure of covenant unfaithfulness. That background makes the promises of chapters 34 through 37 more than political recovery. The shepherd, the cleansing, the spirit, and the reunited people answer a wound deeper than lost territory. The dry bones vision makes that depth unmistakable. The bones are described as very dry, and the people interpret themselves as cut off. When life comes, it comes by God's word and spirit, not by a remnant's ability to organize its own rescue. Even the reunification of the two sticks is given as a work God will accomplish. The restored people in the next movement of the book are therefore not presented as a self-made power that has earned invulnerability. They are living because God has acted where life seemed impossible. That is why the transition into Gog has such tension. A gathered people can still look fragile. a renewed land can still be exposed. The promise of restoration has not erased the memory of siege, collapse, and displacement. Ezekiel places the final threat precisely where a reader might expect the book to rest in relief. The enemy's arrival asks whether restoration is secure only while no one challenges it, or whether the God who restores can also preserve what he restores. The chapters after Gog complete the same arc. Ezekiel's temple vision is not a detour into architectural detail after a war story. It culminates in the return of divine glory and a land ordered around God's presence. The last words of the book name the city by a theological claim: "The Lord is there." Between bones receiving breath and a city defined by God's presence, Gog's assault is the last loud contradiction. It will be answered not by a stronger human empire, but by the holiness and nearness the whole book has been moving toward. For Ezekiel's first hearers, that sequence carried a severe comfort. Babylon had proved that walls, kings, and institutions could fall. The prophet did not replace that failed security with a promise that future walls would be impregnable. He carried the people toward a different center: God's name, God's spirit, God's shepherding, and God's dwelling. Gog appears at the threshold of that center. The question is no longer whether Israel can return from death. It is whether the God who gives that life will allow hostile power to define its future. Long before Ezekiel spoke in Babylon, the names behind Gog's coalition had entered Israel's memory through a genealogy. Genesis chapter 10 follows the flood with a table of nations. Japheth's line includes Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The list is neither a modern atlas nor a secret code. It is Israel's way of remembering a human world spread outward after judgment. When Ezekiel reaches for Magog, Meshech, Tubal, and Gomer, he reaches into that inherited world. The names summon regions and peoples beyond Israel's center, places known at the edges of commerce and empire. The prophecy can therefore sound ancient and far-reaching at once. Its threat is drawn from the broad horizon Israel already knew, not from a list designed for future nation-states. Meshech and Tubal also appear in Ezekiel's own world of trade. In chapter 27, Tyre's commerce includes slaves and bronze from Tubal and Meshech. Assyrian records use names commonly connected with Mushki and Tabal, groups associated with Anatolia in the first millennium before Christ. The connections are historical reconstructions, and they help locate Ezekiel's vocabulary within his age rather than beyond history. Gomer is often linked by scholars with Cimmerian peoples known in ancient sources, while Beth Togarmah is frequently placed in Anatolian settings. These associations have limits. Ancient names could shift, overlap, and survive in new usage. Their value lies in showing how Ezekiel's audience could hear a coalition gathered from the wider world known to them, not in assigning a compulsory identity to a government many centuries later. Josephus, writing long after Ezekiel, associated Magog with the Scythians. His statement shows how one Jewish historian of the first century understood the name. It does not settle every geographic question, and it does not erase the older setting of the prophecy. The line from Genesis to Ezekiel to Josephus carries memory across centuries, but memory is not a license to turn each name into a modern prediction. Northward associations are present in the material, especially around Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah. Yet Gog's army refuses to stay in one direction. The list in Ezekiel chapter 38 opens outward. Once Persia, Cush, and Put join the march, the question is no longer which northern power alone occupies the frame. The coming storm gathers pieces of Ezekiel's world from several horizons. Genesis gives the names their first biblical frame, but it does not give them the kind of precision a later census would provide. The Table of Nations groups peoples through ancestral lines in order to portray humanity spreading across the world after the flood. Its purpose is theological as well as geographic. All nations share a human origin, and all stand within the reach of the God who judges and preserves. When Ezekiel draws on that vocabulary, he can evoke a world beyond Israel without pretending that a genealogy functions as a modern diplomatic registry. The names also appear in a world where trade and war constantly crossed one another. Tyre's wealth in Ezekiel, chapter 27, depends on connections reaching beyond its coast. Tubal and Meshech are listed among trading partners who bring human beings and vessels of bronze. That setting makes the names concrete. They belong to actual networks of exchange and imperial pressure. But it also warns against false exactness. A name may point to a people, a region, or a remembered association without supplying a straight line to a later ethnic or national identity. Assyrian texts are useful precisely because they are external witnesses from Ezekiel's broader era, not because they remove every uncertainty. Mushki and Tabal are commonly connected with Meshech and Tubal, and scholars often locate them in or near Anatolia. The correspondences are plausible and illuminate the ancient horizon. They remain reconstructions based on languages, inscriptions, and changing political landscapes. Responsible historical reading can say what the evidence commonly suggests, while refusing to make that suggestion bear more certainty than it has. Josephus illustrates the same discipline from another angle. His association of Magog with Scythians tells readers how a Jewish writer many centuries after Ezekiel connected an old biblical name with the peoples known in his own intellectual world. It is evidence of reception and interpretation. It is not an inspired glossary added to Genesis or Ezekiel, and it cannot by itself settle where Magog must be placed at every point in history. The value of his witness is that it shows the name remained alive in Jewish memory, even as the known world and its labels changed. Taken together, Genesis, Tyre's trading list, Assyrian parallels, and Josephus offer something more solid than a sensational shortcut. They show why Ezekiel's audience could hear Magog, Meshech, Tubal, and Gomer as names from the outer horizons of the world they knew. The prophecy gathers inherited memory into a new vision of threat. Its imagery is ancient enough to be intelligible to exiles, and broad enough to keep the coming enemy from being reduced to an invented code. The next list will make that breadth visible in every direction around the land. Persia is the clearest name to place historically. It points toward the Iranian plateau and toward a people whose imperial power would later shape the world after Babylon. Its presence makes the coalition broad, even before the southern names appear. Ezekiel does not say that Persia exhausts Gog's identity. Persia stands among allies, one force in a larger assembly moving under Gog's command. Cush reaches south of Egypt toward Nubia and the Upper Nile. Put is commonly located west of Egypt in North Africa. Their appearance draws the coalition away from a single northern line. The prophecy pictures an invasion with a world-sized feel in the horizons available to Ezekiel, an assembly of peoples rather than the army of one empire marching alone. Gomer and Beth Togarmah bring the northern and Anatolian side of the list back into view. The names are joined by the phrase, "many peoples with Gog." That phrase matters as much as any individual place name. Gog is not isolated. He is the head of a crowd, and the crowd's size becomes part of the terror. It rises like weather over a land that thinks it has entered peace. Modern readers often ask which country each name must equal. Ezekiel's list creates a different pressure. It shows a coalition reaching around Israel's world, a concentrated hostility that cannot be understood as one neighbor's ambition. Historical study can illuminate the names. It cannot force them into a final political key that Ezekiel himself does not provide. The coalition's breadth prepares the deeper shock. Gog is not merely surrounded by allies, he is already caught in a purpose larger than his own campaign. The same God who promises to judge the invader speaks of drawing him out. At the center of the prophecy, the map gives way to a hook. The order of the Allies is worth hearing as a composition, not merely as a catalogue. Persia reaches eastward from Israel's horizon. Cush draws the eye south along the Nile world. Put extends the picture toward North Africa. Gomer and Beth Togarmah return the vision toward regions commonly associated with the north and Anatolia. The result is not a survey of every people on earth. It is a coalition whose directions refuse to converge into one neat national identity. Ezekiel describes a hostile gathering with Israel, surrounded by the known world's reach. Even the phrase, "many peoples with you," resists overconfident decoding. It means Gog's strength is amplified by company. The terror is collective. The reader is meant to see a force large enough to darken the land, not to count a fixed alliance from a secret list. That emphasis prepares a central contrast in the prophecy. Gog's gathering looks comprehensive to human sight, but the word of God has already addressed its leader and set the terms of its end. Persia's presence is especially instructive. It is a recognizable ancient name, connected in its original setting with the Iranian plateau and later imperial power. Yet Ezekiel names Persia as one participant among several, not as the name behind Gog. A modern geographic connection may help explain the ancient word, but it cannot transform an ally in Ezekiel's coalition into the required identity of Gog. Nor can it make every later conflict involving that region a fulfillment of the chapter. The same care belongs to Cush and Put. Cush is commonly linked with lands south of Egypt, including Nubia and the Upper Nile, while Put is commonly located west of Egypt in North Africa. Those associations give the coalition a southern reach. They do not make the text a prediction of a modern military bloc. Ezekiel's geographic language works with the world available to a 6th century audience. Its purpose is to make Gog's advance feel vast, coordinated and frightening, before God reveals how little any coordination can alter his judgment. This is where the map begins to serve, rather than rule the reading. It can illuminate the ancient horizons and prevent careless claims that the names are meaningless. It cannot override the prophecy's own movement from coalition to motive, from motive to judgment, and from judgment to the knowledge of God among the nations. Once the full company has gathered, its directions become secondary to the question of who is directing its march. Gog forms an evil plan. He sees a people gathered from the nations, living in settlements without walls, and he imagines plunder. Their livestock, goods, and apparent ease become the bait for his desire. Ezekiel does not soften that intention. Gog wants to take. He wants to seize. The invasion begins in the invader's own greed, with a plan that rises from a heart bent towards spoil. Yet before Gog reaches the land, God says that hooks will be put in his jaws, and that he will be brought out with his army. In the ancient Near East, captives could be led away with hooks, a public image of humiliation and total control. Ezekiel turns that image toward the invader. The leader, who imagines himself pulling nations behind him, is himself being drawn toward judgment. The two truths remain together without canceling each other. Gog intends evil. God governs the limit, the purpose, and the end. The hook never turns Gog into a victim of divine cruelty, and his ambition never places him outside God's rule. He chooses the invasion, but he does not choose the end of his story. God names the purpose of the confrontation. The nations will know him when he is sanctified through Gog before their eyes. The coming judgment is public because the lie behind the invasion is public. Gog acts as if strength, numbers, and surprise can decide the fate of a restored people. The prophecy answers by placing the invader's confidence inside a boundary he cannot see. This tension has weight beyond ancient geography. Human power often believes its own momentum. A ruler calls a plan inevitable. An army calls its advance irreversible. A crowd calls its anger righteous because it is shared. Gog's march exposes the old deception. Evil can move with intention and still move only as far as God permits. The restored people give Gog every reason to misread them. Ezekiel describes villages without walls, gates, or bars. In an ancient land, walls were not decoration. They gave warning, refuge, and the smallest chance to delay an army. A settlement without them could look exposed from every ridge. Gog sees that exposure and mistakes it for an invitation. The people have been gathered from many nations. They possess cattle and goods. They dwell in a land that had long been desolate and has become inhabited again. To an invader, the details form a ledger of possible gain. Peace looks soft, prosperity looks unguarded. Gog's imagination turns the restored life of the people into a prize he believes his force can take. Ezekiel makes the vulnerability plain because the outcome must not be explained by a hidden general or a superior wall. No champion steps forward to duel Gog. No battle plan is praised. The people are present, but their military achievement is absent from the story. Their safety will reveal the God who restored them, not the brilliance of a commander. The image of unwalled villages also changes the meaning of security. Gog trusts defenses he can measure: horses, weapons, allies, and numbers. The people of the land appear to have none of those things in the moment that matters. Their peace stands exposed before an enemy who arrives like a cloud. The apparent weakness becomes the stage on which the true ruler of the story will be known. The cloud finally rises over the land. Gog comes from the far north with a great company, horses, and many peoples. The army's arrival receives more attention than any contest of soldiers. Ezekiel lets its scale press down on the land. The invasion looks unstoppable because it is meant to look that way before the first stroke of judgment falls. God's fury rises against Gog, and creation itself answers. A great earthquake shakes the land of Israel. Fish, birds, beasts, creeping things, and people tremble. Mountains are thrown down, cliffs collapse, and walls fall to the ground. The army that crossed borders in confidence meets a world whose foundations no longer remain still beneath it. Then the violence turns inward. Every man's sword comes against his brother. The coalition built from many peoples becomes a place of confusion and self-destruction. Ezekiel's image recalls earlier biblical judgments in which God turned an enemy force against itself, as in the days of Gideon and Jehoshaphat. The echo is restrained, but the pattern is clear. God can break an army without handing glory to a human hero. Pestilence, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone complete the judgment. Ezekiel does not linger over tactics because tactics are not the point. The invading force does not lose because a better army finally arrives. Its defeat reveals the holiness of the god Gog, treated as irrelevant. The land is defended by the one Gog never included in his calculations. The army came to take a people who seemed undefended. It becomes the evidence of its own collapse. No military genius claims the victory. No king raises a banner over a rival. Gog's campaign ends where every proud campaign ends, when it meets the judgment of God. Its strength becomes a witness against it. What the army leaves behind keeps the prophecy from ending with the last weapon dropped on the field. Ezekiel slows down over the aftermath. The people who were meant to be plundered gather the bows, arrows, shields, bucklers, and weapons of the defeated force. The instruments of invasion pass into the hands of those Gog intended to strip bare. For 7 years, Ezekiel says, the inhabitants use those weapons for fuel. The prophecy gives the number without inviting invented calculations about their modern manufacture or calendar placement. Its purpose is the reversal itself. An army carried its power into the land as a threat. The land absorbs the wreckage of that power into ordinary survival, warming homes with what came to destroy them. The burial lasts 7 months. The scale is so vast that a special valley east of the sea receives the multitude, and it is called Hamon Gog, the multitude of Gog. The leader who marched to possess the land leaves his name on a graveyard within it. He comes to take the land. His name remains over a burial place in the land. The valley is Gog's mirror. His ambition seeks a memorial of conquest, a place where his strength will be remembered. The prophecy gives him a memorial, but its meaning is fixed by defeat. The name survives not above a throne or a border, but above the place where the invader's multitude had to be removed from the land it tried to own. The image reaches toward the first personal turn of the film. Every heart knows the temptation to treat visible strength as the author of the future. Gog's Valley says otherwise. Power can arrive loud, organized, and convinced of its right to take. It can still leave behind nothing but the record of where it fell. The field is not yet empty in Ezekiel's vision. Before the burial is complete, another summons goes out, this time to birds and beasts. Their feast will carry the scene beyond the mountains of Israel and into the final visions of Revelation. The summons is severe because the judgment has been severe. God calls every kind of bird and beast to gather around his sacrifice. They are told to eat flesh and drink blood from the mighty men, princes, horses, riders, and warriors who had filled the land with their threat. The language turns a victory feast inside out. Those who expected to consume a nation become food upon the field. Ezekiel calls the slaughter a sacrifice because it belongs to God's verdict. In the ancient world, a sacrificial meal marked fellowship and worship. Here the image is reversed into terror. The animals do not honor Gog. Their presence announces that the army's pride has been reduced beneath the order of the Creator. Rank, armor, and command have no power to preserve the men who gathered against God. The reversal is deliberate. Gog had calculated cattle, goods, villages, and spoil. He saw a people as food for his own appetite. The aftermath turns his calculus over. The invader's army becomes the feast. Ezekiel refuses to make the fallen coalition heroic, even in defeat. Its end is not tragic grandeur. It is a public exposure of ambition that treated lives and land as prey. John takes up this imagery in Revelation chapter 19. An angel standing in the sun calls birds, flying in mid-heaven to the great supper of God. Kings, captains, mighty men, horses, riders, free and slave, small and great, are named in the invitation. The words sound like Ezekiel because John wants the earlier judgment to remain in the ear while the final conflict comes into view. Revelation does not borrow the image as decoration. It carries Ezekiel's vocabulary forward. The birds gather before John explicitly names Gog and Magog in a later vision. Judgment is already being described in Ezekiel's colors. Armies gather against God, their might is exposed, and the created order itself becomes witness to their defeat. This connection keeps the film from treating the prophets as isolated puzzles. Ezekiel's vision had announced that the nations would know the Lord through Gog's fall. Revelation places the same public judgment at the end of a larger story in which the rider, the beast, false worship, and every gathered power are brought under God's verdict. The feast belongs to the same moral world in both books. Ezekiel's purpose statement returns again and again because the invasion must be understood through it. God says he will magnify himself and sanctify himself. The nations will know that he is the Lord. The center of the prophecy is not Israel celebrating a geopolitical victory. It is the holy name of God made known where violence had claimed the last word. That purpose answers an old wound from the exile. When Jerusalem fell, surrounding nations could read the ruin as proof that Judah's God was weak. Ezekiel had already challenged that reading. The exile displayed God's judgment against his own people's rebellion, not his inability to defend them. Restoration would display mercy. Gog's defeat would display holiness before nations that had misunderstood both judgment and mercy. The pattern is wider than one battle. God promises that he will no longer hide his face from his people after the judgment is complete, and he speaks of pouring out his Spirit on the house of Israel. The restored community is not merely returned to territory. It is drawn into the presence and rule of the God whose name has been dishonored among the nations. The language of knowing the Lord therefore carries moral force. The nations are not being handed a lesson in military geography. They are confronted with the God whom conquest cannot replace, exile cannot erase, and rebellion cannot outlast. Gog's army becomes the stage for that knowledge because it arrives believing that visible force can define reality. At this point, the map has already begun to shrink. Historical inquiry still matters. Persia belonged to a real ancient world, as did Cush, Put, Meshech, Tubal, and the peoples associated with Gomer and Togarmah. But the prophecy's own center has moved beyond identification. The names assemble an enemy. The enemy's defeat reveals the Lord. That order protects history from being turned into panic. The deceiver can gather nations at the edges of the earth. Yet the question remains, what gives that multitude its frightening appearance? If this mystery invites deeper investigation, Patreon holds exclusive content and deeper investigations, while Buy Me a Coffee helps sustain the work. Both links are quietly in the pinned comment or the description. John answers by describing a number like the sand of the sea, and then showing how swiftly heaven answers it. The next step must be taken carefully. Ezekiel's language and Revelation's language meet, but readers have long differed over how the millennial scenes and Ezekiel's restoration relate in chronology. Some place Ezekiel's battle before the 1,000 years described in Revelation 20. Others connect it with the final revolt after that period. Others see prophetic imagery working across a broader final horizon. The names themselves show what John does with them. When Ezekiel's historical setting, his prophetic vision, and John's later use remain distinct, the connection grows clearer rather than weaker. Ezekiel gives Gog a leader, a coalition, a land, and a burial valley. John will take Gog and Magog together and place them at the four corners of the earth. The map cannot remain the size it was at the beginning. The valley of Hamon-Gog has closed over the invading multitude, but Revelation opens the horizon again. The next enemy is not confined to the regions Ezekiel's first hearers could name. It rises wherever rebellion can gather, and it marches toward a city beloved by God. The burial valley has one more lesson before the horizon widens. Gog's name was intended to be carried by an army that could alter the land through conquest. Instead, it marks the place where conquest ended. John's vision does not turn the old names into a puzzle with a smaller answer. It enlarges their reach at the very moment it preserves their moral character. Gog's ancient march had been driven by greed, confidence, and contempt for a people God had restored. The gathered nations in Revelation are deceived into the same posture. They approach God's people as though number could overturn promise. The release of Satan after the 1,000 years is a grave element of the vision, and Christians have read the millennium through several established frameworks. Premillennial, amillennial, and post-millennial readings arrange its relation to Ezekiel in different ways. None gains permission to detach John's scene from its plain movement. The deceiver gathers nations, they surround the saints, God judges them, and the final throne follows. The range of those readings makes one discipline essential. A reader can hold a settled conviction about the millennium without forcing Ezekiel's named coalition into a timetable the prophet does not state. The visions are allowed to retain their own contours: Ezekiel's burial valley, John's final encirclement, and the unbroken certainty that God judges the rebellion raised against him. John's phrase, "like the sand of the sea," gives the rebellion overwhelming visual scale. Sand cannot be counted by an army officer standing on a ridge. It suggests multitudes beyond a commander's ability to name, a pressure created by sheer number. Yet the vision grants the multitude no victorious action. They advance over the breadth of the earth and are stopped by fire from heaven. The beloved city is not described as surviving through its own military genius. Like Ezekiel's unwalled villages, it stands within a promise that its enemies cannot calculate. The gathered nations see an object before them, a people and a place. God sees a rebellion under judgment. The difference between those two visions decides the outcome before the siege reaches its imagined conclusion. Fire descends from God and devours them. John does not stage a long exchange of weapons because the final conflict is not balanced. The rebels have gathered against the one whose throne gives existence to the earth they cross. The speed of the judgment refuses to flatter their strength. Their vastness is real, their danger is real, and neither is sovereign. The devil's judgment follows the destruction of those he deceived. He is thrown into the lake of fire, joining the beast and the false prophet. The vision names no escape route for the power that has nourished deception across the story. The deceiver who made rebellion look reasonable is exposed as a defeated creature before the court of God. Then John sees the great white throne. The shift is immense. A battlefield is still visible in the imagination, but the next scene is judicial. Earth and sky flee from the presence of the one on the throne. The language does not invite a reader to locate a hiding place behind a nation, an army, or an inherited identity. Every shelter made by power disappears before judgment. The dead stand before God, great and small. Their distinctions of status have not vanished from memory, but none provides privilege. Books are opened, and another book is opened, the book of life. Each person faces a judgment that no crowd can absorb on another's behalf. Gog's story had begun with a leader and his multitude. The throne brings every multitude down to persons. The sea gives up its dead. Death and Hades give up their dead. John piles the images together because no domain can keep what God summons to judgment. A grave, a sea, a forgotten battlefield, and the invisible realm of the dead all yield their occupants. The final court is not limited by geography, chronology, or the reach of human record. Death and Hades themselves are cast into the lake of fire. The enemy at the end is not merely a coalition with a familiar name. Death is judged. The place that had held the dead is judged. This is the horizon toward which Gog's invasion finally points. Human rebellion brings ruin, and God's judgment reaches the ruin at its root, rather than leaving it to rise under another banner. The Book of Life gives the vision its deepest urgency. John is not offering an abstract lesson about future wars. He is describing the final reality before which every life will stand. The names Gog and Magog become terrifying precisely because they reveal a gathered rebellion. The Book of Life reveals that no one is saved by blending into that crowd. The movement from Ezekiel to Revelation keeps the same moral line without flattening their different scenes. Ezekiel's Gog is a ruler over a named coalition that attacks restored Israel. John's Gog and Magog are nations deceived across the earth. In both visions, the enemy comes against God's people. God acts decisively, and his holiness becomes public. The continuity lies in God's victory over rebellion. That continuity is stronger than any attempt to predict a headline. A modern nation can resemble ancient Persia in a geographical sense, and a present conflict can stir fears already familiar to readers of prophecy. Resemblance does not equal fulfillment. Ezekiel's own geography has to be heard before John's universal horizon can be understood, and John's horizon keeps the final meaning from being imprisoned within a single border. The question behind the map is therefore not answered by indifference to history. The ancient names had histories. Exiles in Babylon heard them with associations unavailable to later readers. Assyrian, Anatolian, African and Persian horizons give the coalition texture. Careful study honors those horizons. It becomes reckless only when it declares a certainty that the prophecy has not declared. The final world John sees begins after judgment has cleared the field. A new heaven and a new earth appear, for the first heaven and first earth have passed away. The language is not a temporary ceasefire after a war. It announces creation renewed under God's reign, where the old order of death and curse no longer determines the life of those who belong to Him. The holy city comes down from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Its descent reverses the old human project of making a name by rising upward. Babel sought a tower reaching toward heaven so that people could make a name for themselves. The New Jerusalem comes from God. It is received, not seized. Its glory is gift, not conquest. A voice from the throne declares that God's dwelling is with humanity. That sentence answers the ache that runs through Ezekiel's exile. The temple had been lost, the city had fallen, the people had feared abandonment. Ezekiel's later visions promise restored presence. Revelation carries that promise to the place where nothing can drive God's people from Him again. God wipes away every tear. Death is no more. Mourning, crying, and pain pass away with the former things. These words do not minimize the violence of Gog's army or the grief of exile. They name the end of every condition that made such violence able to wound. The God who judges evil also removes the world in which evil continues to claim its victims. Ezekiel's river provides a bridge into this renewal. In chapter 47, the prophet watches water flow from the temple threshold. It deepens with every measured distance until it becomes a river impossible to cross. Wherever it goes, dead waters receive life. Fish multiply, trees grow along its banks, bearing fruit each month and offering leaves for healing. That river is not a decorative detail after Gog. It answers the enemy's whole project. Gog advances to take goods from a people and land he treats as consumable. God's river moves outward to give life where death had ruled. Gog gathers to devour. God's presence produces abundance that heals. The two movements expose the difference between domination and the kingdom of God. Revelation chapter 22 places the river of the water of life at the center of the city. It flows from the throne of God and of the Lamb. The source is personal and royal. Life does not rise from the city's engineering or from its stores. It comes from God's throne, the place of rule that Gog and every gathered rebellion had tried to challenge. The tree of life appears on either side of the river, bearing 12 kinds of fruit. Its leaves are for the healing of the nations. The detail reaches back beyond Ezekiel to Eden, where human beings lost access to the tree after sin entered the world. The final city holds life openly, and the nations once mobilized for rebellion are named in relation to healing. There is no curse there. The throne of God and of the Lamb is in the city, and His servants serve Him. They see His face. The promised presence is no longer mediated through exile, distance, or threatened sanctuary. The God whose glory departed from a defiled temple in Ezekiel's earlier visions makes His home with a people who will never again be driven from it. The new city also has no need of a temple in the way the old world did, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. This does not cancel Ezekiel's vision as if it had failed. It brings its longing to completion. The goal was always God among His people. When that presence fills everything, no hostile army can stand outside the gate waiting to challenge it, nor does the city need sun or moon to give it light, for God's glory gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. The nations walk by that light, and the kings of the earth bring their glory into it. Gog's coalition had made the nations an instrument of invasion. John's final city shows nations healed and their true glory brought under God's reign rather than raised against it. Its gates are never shut by day, and there is no night there. Ancient cities closed gates because danger could come through them. Ezekiel's restored people had looked vulnerable without walls. John's city is secure for a deeper reason. Its openness is not naivety. Evil has been judged, death has passed away, and the God on the throne keeps his dwelling without threat. This is the final contrast in the story. Gog's world is driven by fear of scarcity, hunger for spoil, and the need to secure power before another person takes it. The city of God is filled by the river of life, the healing of nations, and the presence of the Lamb. One world gathers by force, the other is given by grace. The film's second personal turn belongs here. The prophecies do not ask a spectator merely to admire a distant ending. They reveal the kind of allegiance hidden inside every smaller choice. A person can be shaped by the hunger to possess, the pleasure of joining a hostile crowd, or the trust that life comes from the throne of God and the Lamb. Gog's army arrives with many peoples, and its size gives it the appearance of destiny. Revelation's multitude is like the sand of the sea, and its size gives it the same appearance. The city of God teaches another measure. The Lamb has authority where crowds have none. The names in the book of life matter where banners and numbers have become useless. Revelation chapter 20 begins after Satan has been bound for 1,000 years and then released for a short time. John sees him go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth. Gog and Magog, whose number is like the sand of the sea. The phrase joins the names as a single expression for a rebellion gathered on a scale Ezekiel's earlier geography could not contain. The four corners of the earth do not identify four particular states. They announce the reach of the deception. Nations are gathered from every direction, countless as sand, moving with the old confidence of rebellion. John's Gog and Magog are not simply a renamed northern army. The names have become the language of worldwide hostility against God and his people. They march across the breadth of the earth and surround the camp of the saints and the beloved city. The image recalls Ezekiel's threatened land, but the scale has changed. There is no extended human counterattack. Fire comes down from God out of heaven and devours the gathered force. The final siege receives no heroic duel because the same truth governs it. Rebellion does not set the terms of its own end. The devil, who deceived the nations, is thrown into the lake of fire, where the beast and the false prophet already are. John then sees a great white throne. Earth and sky flee from the presence seated upon it. The dead stand before God, great and small, and the books are opened. The story has moved beyond the fate of one coalition to the judgment of every human life. This is why John's use matters for the question behind the map. He takes names rooted in Ezekiel's ancient horizon and uses them for the final gathering of nations against God. That canonical expansion makes a single contemporary country too small to bear the whole meaning. It does not erase Ezekiel's historical world. It shows that the prophet's enemy has become a pattern of rebellion, reaching wherever nations resist God's reign. John makes the map larger until it can no longer hide the real enemy, rebellion gathered against God's reign. The final assault has the size of the earth, yet its end comes with the same sudden certainty that Ezekiel gave to Gog. Numbers like sand do not create a second throne. A city surrounded does not become abandoned. Fire from God ends a siege that appears for one moment to include the world. The sequence also clarifies what cannot be claimed. Revelation chapter 20 does not name a modern flag. It names Gog and Magog after Satan's release and describes nations from the four corners of the earth. Readers can debate how this vision relates chronologically to Ezekiel's chapters 38 and 39, but the universal language in John is plain enough to resist any claim that one present government is the prophecy's required answer. The climax is not the fire alone. It is the throne after the fire. Gog's coalition in Ezekiel had come to prove that strength could seize a restored land. The nations in Revelation come to prove that rebellion can surround the beloved city. Both claims end before God. The final question is no longer where the invaders came from. It is where every person stands when the books are opened. After that throne, the images that replace Gog are not weapons, graves, or borders. John sees a new heaven and a new earth. He sees the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God. A loud voice declares that the dwelling place of God is with humanity. The promise Ezekiel carried through exile and restoration reaches its final, unthreatened form. Ezekiel had already been led into a vision of restored presence. In the final chapters of his book, a temple stands as the place where God's glory dwells among his people. Water flows from that sanctuary, first as a trickle and then as a river no one can cross. It brings life wherever it goes, healing the waters and causing trees to bear fruit along its banks. Revelation returns to that river after the last judgment. The river of the water of life flows from the throne of God and of the Lamb. The tree of life stands beside it bearing fruit, and its leaves are for the healing of the nations. The nations that once gathered under Gog's name have no future in rebellion. God's final city is marked by life, healing, and the unveiled presence of his throne. The change is total because the enemy's project has failed at every level. Gog wanted spoil and received a grave. The gathered nations in Revelation wanted a city and received judgment. The new creation holds no place for the old ambition to dominate, devour, and defy. What remains is not a fortified world waiting for another assault. It is God dwelling with his people, wiping away tears, death, mourning, crying, and pain. The opening map can return now. Its flags have been removed because Ezekiel's words were never finally secured to them. Gog is a leader tied to Magog in Ezekiel. The coalition uses names familiar to the prophet's ancient world. Revelation then uses Gog and Magog for the gathered rebellion of nations at the earth's four corners. Historical study has a real task, but speculative certainty has no throne in the prophecy. The mother question can now be answered. God directs the story without excusing Gog's evil. Gog desires the invasion, gathers the peoples, and reaches for spoil. God sets the hook, establishes the limit, and turns the assault into a revelation of his holiness. Gog advances by wicked intent only as far as judgment permits. He never controls the ending he imagines he owns. This answer reaches beyond every generation that has tried to find safety by naming an enemy on a map. The map can describe borders, histories, alliances, and fears. It cannot settle the deepest line in Ezekiel's vision. That line runs between rebellion that gathers against God and the God who makes his dwelling with his people. For the viewer, that line becomes personal without becoming vague. A heart can stand with the crowd because the crowd is large, because its anger feels justified, because its power appears permanent. Gog's story ends with a different measure. God sees the intent beneath the march. He sees the plans made for spoil. He sees the moment when a person chooses the gathered rebellion over the God who gives life. What changed for you when Gog's name became a burial valley instead of a conquest? The question reaches back to the first map and forward to the throne. It asks whether the story is being read as a hunt for a flag or as a warning that no rebellion, however organized, can write the final line. The city Ezekiel foresaw was never secured by Gog's defeat alone. Its deepest safety was the presence of God. The river, the tree, the healing of the nations and the throne all carry the same promise. God has not surrendered his world to its loudest armies. He brings judgment against evil, gathers his people, and makes his dwelling among them. Those who feel the weight of that promise can answer it openly. Write these words as a confession of where your life belongs. Lord Jesus, I belong to you. You alone are the Savior of my soul. The final choice is not between one modern nation and another. It is between the rebellion that surrounds God's city and the Savior who receives those who come to him. Gog never authored the story.